Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Melinda Blau, longtime journalist and best-selling author, about the radical ambition of becoming and being a good old lady. In this conversation, we explore her latest and perhaps most personal book yet, The Wisdom Whispers, which chronicles her decades-long friendships with 9 extraordinary women in their 90s and 100s. Women who redefined what it means to age well. Melinda didn't just interview these women. She's lived alongside them, learning from their wit, resilience, and unwavering curiosity. The result is part relational memoir, part aging manifesto, and entirely a celebration of elderhood. We talk about why women often lead the way in aging, what makes someone a good old lady, and how Melinda, now in her 80s herself, is becoming a wisdom whisperer for the next generation. We also cover consequential strangers, the surprising joys of late-light friendships, and how aging, when embraced, becomes a privilege and a superpower. Melinda offers a fresh, funny, and fiercely honest voice on what it means to grow older and how to do it well. For anyone curious about what the fourth quarter of life can look like, this episode is full of both inspiration and instruction. So, welcome Melinda Blau to Four Quarter Live. Wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You've had a rich and varied writing life, Melinda. Can you take us back a little bit? Where did it start and what led you to this wonderful book, The Wisdom Whispers?
It's a long journey.
I know, it's a long story.
Well, I was in educational publishing first, and then I segued into journalism in the late 70s and was writing books by the 90s. Actually, it's kind of interesting to use your vernacular in the, we write about what we're going through. And in my second quarter and third quarter, I wrote a lot about parenting because I had children. And in my fourth quarter, luckily, I had already started befriending much older women. And I started thinking about a book about them. I didn't know what that book was going to be, but I started realizing that as I was aging, these much older women were a tremendous resource. I wasn't yet in my fourth quarter. And by my fourth quarter, I actually sat down and wrote the book. Now, I called them, all those years, I thought of them as my old ladies, which was something that absolutely appalled my contemporaries. You can't call them that. That's an insult. And I said, no, not the way I mean. And
not the way they hear it, I imagine.
No, not the way when you're 90 or 100, you're old.
Yeah.
And you have no problem with the word.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we live in an ageist society and everybody has problems with the word.
I try and claim it. I keep calling myself old. I'm ready to take on the men.
Good. That is a good thing. And I'm kind of like the Elmer Gantry of aging. I want people to get out there.
So you befriended all these significantly older ladies kind of by chance and kind of over a long period of time.
Yes, almost 40 years.
Yep.
And I started when I was 46, when I wanted nothing to do with old people. I mean, I was as ageist without even knowing the word as the next person at 46. So when I met these women and I started realizing how much they were doing for me, I said, I'm going to write about it someday. And someday came when I was 80. And then in my fourth quarter, solidly in my fourth quarter.
Yeah, the moment when you needed the lessons to be digested and applied is when you actually sat down and realized the richness that you had collected for years and years. Fascinating. So you said this book was quite different than some of your earlier work, more personal, more reflective. When did you realize you were going to put a lot about your own story in it? Was it you didn't set out for a kind of memoir?
No. But what I realized when I sat down to write the book, I wasn't writing their biographies. I was writing about our relationships, and it takes two to make a relationship. So I had to put myself in there because I was part of the story I was telling. So, for example, when I met my first old lady and I was 46, I had just finished a divorce. I was in the throes of the end of it. And that was a very different head than when I met, for example, Zelda, and I was in my early 60s. And then Marge, I met when I was 79. So I was a different person in each of those relationships as well. And I have to say, I had a wonderful editor who pushed me to do that because he said, the lessons make sense when we realize where you were in it. Yeah. So it was a very wise decision. But I certainly didn't set out. In fact, people say, oh, this is your memoir. I said, no, this is not a memoir. If anything, it's a relational memoir.
Okay, we're going to get to the actual cast of characters and the 9 ladies in a minute, but I really liked your writing about wanting to be a good old lady. So what does that mean? And you obviously had the example of these role models in front of you. It sounds still like such a radical ambition to be a good old lady.
Well, it is a radical ambition, and I still fight with my contemporaries about the term my old lady. And basically, to me, a good old lady is somebody who's engaged and curious. And really, my friends lived into, some of them are dead now. They're still very much alive, which is why I talk about them in the present sense. But they lived until they died, till the minute they died. They never gave up. They always had interest. They always had something that they were involved in. They did not retreat from life. And of course, the stereotype of an old person is sitting alone in a room, retreating from life, not having any interest. And they were anything but that.
So looking back, would you say this is some kind of new older life feminist manifesto for us older ladies?
I didn't write it that way, but I've always believed that women lead the way. And there are some good reasons for that. And there's lots of research to back it up that women are the natural connectors. And as you get old, that is probably the most important skill, is to connect with people. And women
keep connecting and to keep connecting new people. Yep.
Yes. Zelda used to say, I have to replenish because you get old and all your friends are gone. Yep. So they really showed me that it is a radical ambition, and it is a woman's. People always say to me, can't you have a good old man? I said, yes, you can. There aren't as many good old men around as there are good old women. And that's because there is, as much as I hate to say this, fundamental differences, and this is cultural, between men and women. And women are better equipped, maybe because they've been stepped on their whole life, to fight back, to be strong, to say, I'm going to do it my way. And I think so in a way, maybe it is a feminist manifesto. I didn't intend it to be that, though.
Well, and I think it also underlines the increasing importance of relational skill as you age. And sadly, that we're not always equipping men with as early and as consistently as we have women. And I hope that will change.
Yes, yes.
Okay, let's turn to the women who whispered. And there are 9 of them in all. Yes. But you said you would focus on your 2 favorites. So who are they and what made them so memorable? And you'll have to read the book, all you listeners, if you want to get the full and very rich cast of characters. All
of them were friends except one who was an aunt. But the 2 that I often speak about, I say in the beginning of the book, as with any group of friends, you spend more time with some, you get to know them better. Some are more open than others. So for me, that was Zelda and Marge. And Zelda I met in my 60s, and she was just a delight. She picked me up. She was the only old lady that picked me up. She picked me up at the tennis court. She played tennis until 99. And she lived.
What does picking you up look like at your age? What does that mean?
It was great. It was such a wonderful moment. And I talk about this in the book. I was coming off the tennis courts, and I hadn't played tennis in about 25 years. And I had just started going to Miami, and there was a tennis court. So I said, maybe I'll try tennis again. And as I came off the court, this little woman who was a minute of a woman, she was maybe 5 foot. And she was wearing a big white visor and dressed all in white. And she was holding a Prince racket that looked bigger than her. And she said to me, she had this gravelly voice, and she said, "Dear, you have such a nice stroke."
That's a good pickup line.
It was a great pickup line. And she said it, and she had these sparkling blue eyes. And she put her hand on my hand. And normally that's a little strange for a stranger to do that. But it felt so natural from her because she was so warm. And that was the beginning. And I said, "Well, thank you. I just started playing tennis after 25 years. And she said, "Well, if you play as long as I do, you'll get as good as I am." And I said, "How long have you been playing?" And she said, 70 years. She only looked like, now this is sort of an ageist thing to say, she looked like she was in her 80s, but very weathered and tan. And so I started doing the math. I said, "When did you start?" She said, "Oh, when I was 21. She was 91.
Wow.
And as I said, she lived almost to 105. And she had a steel trap mind. She remembered, she loved dirty jokes and uplifting sayings, and she had them all in her head, and she could call on them. You mentioned dogs. She had a joke about dogs. I used to invite friends to my house and make dinner parties for her because she was such a treat. So that was Zelda in my 60s. And then when I was in my 70s, I was just about 70, I met Marge at the Christmas party in my building. And she was at the buffet. And I had seen her on the roof. She was a very elegant New York woman. Zelda was from St. Louis, but Marge was obviously very New York, elegant. And I walked up to her. At this point, I had collected a few old ladies. So I said, "This is what I want to know." So I walked up next to her on the buffet and I started talking to her. And she told me she moved into the building 2 days after Pearl Harbor. So this was her 75th anniversary in the building. She was 99. And again, she had a steel trap mind. She was very witty. Zelda was funny, but she was funny like a Borscht Belt entertainer. Marge was really witty. So as she was going back to her seat, she used a rollator, and she put the paper plate of food on the rollator. And as a joke, you're not supposed to joke with people you don't know or have just met. I said to her, "Marge, be careful that you don't forget and sit down." And she goes, "That's a really good suggestion. Then again, I like to make a good impression." And then that was it. I was had. And so I went back and I sat with her and I said, "Would you ever go out to dinner with me?" She goes, "Oh, absolutely." And so that was the beginning of Marge and me. And she was just wonderful and tremendously independent. She lived to 104 and a quarter.
Yeah, so you really managed to identify women with an appetite for life and a curiosity that kept them becoming this rare breed of centenarians.
Well, I never thought of this, but now that you just say identify, when you're out in public and you see somebody who's 90 or 100 and they're in public, that alone tells you something.
Yeah.
It tells you this is a person still out there, still in the game. And so it becomes easier to identify them.
So in the book, you describe each of these wonderful kind of new role models of a different kind of aging, and you pull a lesson from each of them. So Zelda's line that you refer to was "look for the good," and you explain how that helped you later in your own life when you were combating illness. Can you share a little bit what that lesson changed for you?
Yeah, well, I've knock on wood, I've lived a very healthy life. And until I got bitten by a mosquito last summer, just as the book was coming out, and I got West Nile disease.
That's a nasty.
I ended up in the hospital for 8 days, sicker than I've ever been, lying there thinking, is this what old feels like? And I remembered Zelda's "look for the good." Now, my left leg was practically paralyzed. I couldn't lift it more than that. And I said, first, what good is this? There's no good here. But there was good. It was only one leg. Had it been 2 legs, I would have been in a rehab in a wheelchair. And throughout my recovery, my physical recovery, I kept thinking of Zelda because I don't like physical exercise. I don't like to go to the gym, and I've needed a lot of it since West Nile. And I keep hearing Zelda's voice. Come on, honey, you can do it. You can do it.
So they've stayed with you, those voices.
Oh, they
And Marge also, you say, insisted on doing absolutely everything herself, despite her own limitations. How did that help I imagine that also contributed to you.
That helped me a lot because as soon as I got home from the hospital, of course, my partner wanted to do everything for me. And I said, no, let me try it myself first. So very early on, I was doing things like emptying the dishwasher and feeling really proud of myself. Because I'll tell you one thing, as you get older, when you get into your 90s and 100s, you appreciate that you're still emptying your own dishwasher or that you still can reach for the glasses on the high shelf. And Marge really showed me that because I met her later in my life. Well, it was later in her life too, and she lived in my building. So I had the chance to actually watch her in her everyday life. How do you cope at 102, 103, 104?
Yeah, most of us don't have any idea.
No. And she was so clever. She would do things like when she didn't want to bend down to the newspaper, she got the idea of hanging an empty plastic bag on the doorknob so that when the guy delivered the newspaper, instead of him throwing it at the door, she met him one morning and she said, I'm 102. Would you put it in the bag? And he did. And those are the kind of things I watched her. I watched her pay her bills. I watched her field requests for money from different organizations. And she allowed me to see all that. I also went out in the neighborhood with her and I remember one of the first walks we took, she walked with this rollator and we got we lived in Manhattan. And when we got to the curb, I didn't want to do anything without asking. So I just stayed quiet and I watched her expertly negotiate down the curb. And I said, I was going to ask you if you needed help. She said, no, I promise I'll ask if I need help. And that was some other important lesson because there's independence and there's interdependence. And when you get older, you have to know what you can't do any longer. And you have to be able to ask for help rather than put yourself in danger. Like Marge told me she stopped getting on ladders at 99. I think that was a little late. But
I think that's a little late. I've certainly been telling my husband that's a little late. You can hear that these women gave you a roadmap for someplace you could follow in. It wouldn't be foreign lands to you when you started having the kind of handicaps or limitations that they had. You'd already seen it addressed, and that gave, I imagine, you a great deal more sort of ease.
It was unbelievable. See, the thing is, I always say to people, they gave me a preview of aging. Most of us don't even want to look at old people, no less what they might have to encounter. These were not women, by the way, that lived charmed lives. They had illnesses. They lost husbands. They lost many, many loved ones. And yet they kept going. And so I got to watch that. And even though I will have a different life and I will have different challenges, whoever imagined West Nile disease, the principles are there. The principles are putting one foot in front of another and just moving ahead no matter what, because stuff happens throughout life.
You also said that these ladies didn't offer advice. They kind of modeled it instead. What made them worth watching in later life? What is it that makes somebody?
Just how engaged they were, how positive they were, that they in their 90s and 100s felt that they had purpose. They were all very social, every one of them. And that to me is probably, if there's a key to a good life, I might always say, if you have good at relationships, you're good at life. Yeah. And I started saying that long before I got old. But now, being an old person myself, I know that that's my superpower, that I know how to connect with people. I like people. I find them interesting. I'm curious in their stories. And that's what I saw in these women. Because
curiosity is a huge piece, right? To stay open.
Yes. And you don't need to have good vision to connect with people. You may lose your hearing, but people can talk louder or you can get a hearing aid. You don't need to be able to walk. You can be in a wheelchair to connect with people. So it doesn't matter what happens to you. You always have that social muscle that you can use.
I think that's a social muscle, probably needs developing. We're worried about our young kids who are losing some of that ability. So you've described them now as kind of sitting on your shoulder, even the ones who have left this earth. Do we all need wise elders kind of whispering in our ears? And how would you advise finding them, identifying them? You've become quite specialized. How long did it take you till you realized you were good at this? And this was actually a skill you were.
Well, it not necessarily just the skill of connecting with people. I think I always knew it, but in 2006, between 2006 and 2009, I wrote a book called Consequential Strangers. And Consequential Strangers are everyone outside of your family and close friends. So it's really just about everybody in your universe. And once I wrote that book, that was a very different kind of book than this one. It was a research-based book. I wrote it with a social scientist. And the research is incontrovertible. You need a variety of people in your life, and it shows that you live longer, you are more likely to have opportunities open to you. And we didn't talk about old people in that book at all, because I was only in my 60s. I didn't think of myself as old in my 60s. I might today. I don't know. There's more consciousness of what old is, but I didn't when I was in my 60s. So it didn't even occur to me. But when I would talk about the book and I'd go on tour and I'd be in front of a group of people, somebody invariably would raise their hand, and it was usually their mother. They'd say, "My mother is the queen of consequential strangers." And she would tell me, the person would say how the mother connected and talked to everybody, and it didn't matter. She could be in a restaurant or on the subway or whatever. And I would always say, "And I'll bet you, how old is your mother?" And she would say, 88. "I'll bet you she's a good 88. And they always said yes. So then I realized there was one chapter that was never written in Consequential Strangers. It is definitely a secret weapon when you get older, to be able to connect with people. And you have to have consequential strangers because your loved ones, many of them, except the younger ones, are gone. So you have.
What's the muscle, you think? Just doing it, trying it, reaching?
Just doing it and trying it. And here's the thing. When you said, did I get good at it or get better at it? The more I did it, once I wrote that book, I happened to have moved coincidentally to Paris. And I knew no one here, but I had a dog. So I said, I need consequential strangers in Paris. And I made it my business when I went out with my dog to talk to anybody who had a dog that I liked and seemed somewhat. And very, very quickly, I got to know a lot of people. The more I did this, the more I felt great. The more I saw that I could help people by telling them this or that. I mean, I've had a long career of researching coping skills.
Right.
And I can't help it. It's an occupational hazard. I give advice sometimes even when I'm not.
Help people cope.
But strangers like it because they go, "Oh, wow, I met this stranger. She just told me what to do about my son." Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Value
the more I did it
in the park.
Right. So the more I did it, the more I realized this is a really good thing. And so I did it more. And just the other day, I was walking here and I met this couple. We walked for a couple of blocks. They were lovely. Do you know that 3 or 4 days later, I got a message on LinkedIn from the guy. He said, "It was so nice meeting you." Now, that doesn't usually happen.
Oh.
But all these encounters, whether they're a few minutes or they lead to a relationship, they really matter in your life. Even if it's, God, I remember meeting that person at someone's Christmas party who went to India and I'm going to India. I wonder if I could and you get in touch with them.
I was very struck on our first conversation, just how warmly you and deeply you were comfortable just entering into any kind of conversation that went anywhere, which I think is also very rare, right? That kind of maturity and openness is something I think must impact people very powerfully and gives you a model of attractivity now that you have become one of the wisdom whisperers yourself. Tell me, you're a great model of Q4. I'm very curious about Q4, and I think we need way more role models. So you've offered us 9 of them, but I'm curious for you. What does being a good 81 mean to you now? And I asked that from my sort of mid-60 pivot here.
That's a great question, and I only can answer it now that the book has been out and that I've written about it. And now that I had a couple of people that called me their old lady. But now that the book's out, many people.
You're everybody's old lady.
I am. And you know what? I didn't anticipate this. It's the best feeling in the world, not just because it's a compliment. And people do say, "Oh, you look great for your age." But you know what? I'll be my own spoiler. The last line in the book is that I wanted to turn Gloria Steinem's. When she turned 40, she said, "This is what 40 looks like." So this is what 80 lives like.
Yeah.
It's not just looks. And I think I look good because I feel good inside. And that is what radiates to people. It's not looks. And I talk about it. There's one chapter in the book on presence. And I think what you're talking about is a presence. And one of my old ladies, Betty, she's fabulous. It's not because she's beautiful. It's not, she's not unattractive, but she's not a beautiful woman, but she is so engaging. She dresses well, which helps. And most of my old ladies, it's not even about dressing well. They cared about what they looked like. And that's another way you can spot a good old lady. And I see them all the time in Paris. You can imagine.
Yeah. They're real role models of how to age in Paris.
Yes. And so being an old lady, I talked a lot about go out and get yourself an old lady, but I never thought about how good it is to be someone else's old lady. And I have to tell you, it is the best surprise of writing the book.
So you did talk pretty candidly in the book about planning, or rather the lack of it, for your own later years. So what have you done, and what's now maybe still hard to face? Or is there nothing? Are you at peace with it all?
Well, I'm at peace. I don't know if I'm going to live to 83 or 93 or 103. And I'm at peace with I have a good life, and whenever I go, I go. So I'm not afraid of dying. And part of that is because I watch my old ladies.
Yeah.
I don't exercise as much as I think I should. I know how important movement is. I struggle with it every day. I usually, my better self, how you call it, my sage self wins. And I say, no, don't cancel the physical trainer. Just do it. Don't skip swimming. Go do it. But I argue with myself about it because it's not something I've always loved doing. That's one of the reasons I admired Zelda, was that she loved exercise.
Yeah.
But the other thing
I think it's admirable to hate it and still force yourself to do it. That's pretty good too. Huh?
Oh, you know what? West Nile forced me to force myself.
Right.
Because I did not want to be disabled. And if I hadn't done it, I would have been.
Yeah.
But the one thing I think that I've sort of shuffling my feet, and this is ironic because in my family, being the writer, I write everybody's obituary. And, all the conscious stuff on aging says, write your own obituary, do your, plan your funeral.
Yep.
I haven't done that. I'm still too young to do that.
Interesting. Okay.
So, but I think it's important. And it's interesting because my daughter is a hospice nurse. And my partner and I had trouble even doing wills and stuff like that. And she kept saying to me, Mom, once you do it, it's done. Once you call the funeral home, it's done. So
what stops you? When are you going to write your obit?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
I have another podcast guest who can help you on that, the Wall Street Journal obit reporter. He wrote a book called Yours Truly. I'll send you the link to his.
I actually think I listened to that and it was great. And I thought of that. I said, now, I wonder, has he written his own obit?
He hasn't finished it, but he's quite a the ways through.
Okay.
It's become more of a memoir, I think.
Well, that's what happens.
So what's your next now from here? Are new adventures, new ideas, explorations? What's calling you from 81?
I don't have a project in mind. I play with a lot of projects. I call it my gerbil brain. So I never lack for ideas. But I live in 3 places. So I don't really want to travel. I travel enough going to those 3 places.
What are the 3? Paris, New York?
Paris, New York, and Miami.
Right.
3 good places.
Good triangle, yep.
And lots of people in all of those places. And that's really my passion at this point in life. And it really makes me happy. And as I said, the more I do it, the more I like it. I think if there's one thing I want to plan, it's a trip, a family vacation, which I've never done with my partner, both my kids, my 3 grandsons, and my kids' partners, obviously. But I haven't planned that yet. But I don't have any, life is busy enough that I don't feel like I have to, people say to me, well, I write another book. I'm not ruling it out. But, and then I come across ideas like yours, which I love, of the 4 quarters. And I think, that's a good book. And then if I think about it, well, do I really want to write that book? No, I don't know if I want to write that book.
We're going to write it. Well, we're going to.
We might.
It's going to be another discussion. Okay, one last whispered truth to younger women who might be listening, or your own younger self. What would you tell them?
Embrace aging and look at it as the gift and the incredible and surprising rewards that it will bring. And only the lucky get to be old. So that's my message to everybody, is to really embrace aging. And that's what I say, my old ladies help me do that instead of dreading it. And I still have fights with lots of my contemporaries over this, but I'm not backing down.
To a possessive pronoun on all our old ladies, Melinda Blau, thank you so much for joining us. You are now definitely inaugurated as one of my old ladies, and
I appreciate that.
To stay in contact for many years to learn.
Yes, definitely.
Good steps to follow.
Definitely.
Thank you so much
for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.